Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our March meeting. I'm very pleased this evening to welcome Professor Plomin, who I first heard giving a lecture at Bristol University, and I was greatly impressed by it. It's really a lecture on science, but it has great philosophical implications because for more than a century, people have been absolutely sure, with the certainty that comes from not having any evidence, of the effects of nature and nurture. But Professor Plomin's work has been applying science to the question to find out what the truth really is. So before we go ahead, could I suggest that you switch off your cameras and certainly mute during the talk. And for questions afterwards, Professor Plomin unfortunately has to go at 8:30, so we won't be having a long session of questions, but if you have some, please use the chat facility, and Andreas will be chairing that, and he'll be receiving your questions. So without further ado, can I pass it to Professor Plomin? Robert.
Good. Well, hello, everyone, and thank you, Don, for finally making this happen. Don's been working on this for 1.5 years. I mean, who would have thought a year ago we would be meeting now still on teleconferencing rather than in person? I'm very sorry I can't be there in person as well. I would love to go to Bath again. It's been about 25 years, so I'd say it's time. So the talk tonight is it's about the importance of genetics for parenting, and especially how the DNA revolution is going to transform parenting. And those of you who haven't heard about any of this stuff previously might find it quite unbelievable, but I would like to say that the results I'll talk about are well-replicated findings. And you might wonder, well, isn't science supposed to be replicable? But you may not know that there's a current replication crisis in science. I don't know if you folks have ever talked about that, but many of our most cherished findings are not replicating. And if you don't know about that, a book by my colleague is really excellent on the topic, describing the reasons for it and the cures for this crisis. But it is a major crisis. And the relevance here is that the research I'm talking to you about does replicate. We generally call it behavioral genetics or psychological genetics. It's genetic influences on psychological sorts of phenomena. And this paper talks about the 10 big findings, the most replicable findings in behavioral genetics. And tonight I'm going to talk about 3 of those. And this is my book, Blueprint, which came out a couple of years ago with Alan Lane and then Penguin in paperback. And the first half of the book talks about topics I'll talk about in the first half of my talk. The second half of the book is about the DNA revolution, so I'll get to that later. In the first half of the book, I'd like to tell you a little bit about disentangling nature and nurture, some of the methods that have been used over the last century to talk about genetic, nature, and environment, nurture, influences. And then the other 2 chapters here are, you'll see the nature of nurture and why children in the same family are so different. These are 2 of the biggest findings in behavioral genetics, and they're about the environment. And the reason for that is, for a century, people, as Don said, assume that nurture explains everything. That's why things run in families, because parents give the kids the environment that is conducive to their development. So by assuming that nurture is important, no one ever considered nature or genetics. And the reason behavioral genetics has made these findings is because they're studying environmental influences in genetically sensitive designs. So I'll begin just by telling you briefly about some of the methods we use. When I came to the UK from the US in 1994, I began this twin study called Twins Early Development Study, TEDS, of 10,000 pairs of twins born in the UK, 94, 95, and 96. And we contacted them via birth records. And it's a it's been going on for 25 years. We've just been funded last month for the next 5 years. So that'd be years 26 to 30. And so it's a longitudinal study of this cohort of twins. And we looked at lots of things that hadn't been studied much before, like behavior problems, psychopathology. But I was always interested in cognitive development. And then when the kids got to school, I was particularly interested in school performance because it hadn't been much studied before. So here, you probably all know about the twin method. You know, 1% of all births are twins. 1/3 of those are identical twins, monozygotic, a single fertilized egg, a zygote. They are clones of one another in terms of their inherited DNA differences. The other 2/3 of twins are called fraternal twins in the rest of the world, but in England, for some reason, they're called non-identical twins. And they're separately fertilized eggs. They're di-2 zygotes, dizygotic, DZ twins. So the essence of the twin method is that if a trait is influenced by genetics, you'd have to predict that the identical twins, who are genetically identical, will be more similar than non-identical twins, who, like any brother and sister, are 50% similar genetically. So that's, and then you can use the twin method as well, not just to say, is there significant genetic influence, but to what extent is genetic influence important? And that has to do with the extent to which identical twins are more similar than fraternal twins. The greater that difference, the greater this genetic influence, which is called heritability. And this is the most confused term probably in genetics. What we're talking about is the extent to which individual differences in the population can be ascribed to inherited DNA differences, nature, or environment. So it's not about an individual, it's about differences, variance in the population. And it's describing what is in a population. So it's saying, I'll talk about weight in a minute. People obviously differ in weight. To what extent is that due to nature or nurture? Well, we're saying in this particular population we study, say the UK now, to what extent are inherited DNA differences important, and to what extent are other things important, environment? It's not talking about what could be. So I'll mention that that weight is probably much more heritable than most people realize. It's actually 60% heritable in the UK. That means inherited DNA differences are responsible for about 60% of the differences that you see between people. So it's about individual differences. It's not to say what could be. So if weight were even 100% heritable, you know you can change weight, because if you don't eat, you lose weight, for example. But what we're saying is, given the diets and exercise and types of food people eat, we're saying inherited DNA differences make a very substantial difference. But that's what is rather than what could be. And we're only studying this normal range of variation that's in our studies. So we're not studying the extremes of abuse or neglect, for example. And then finally, we are talking about genetic influence. That is, we're not talking about innate, immutable, deterministic factors. We're talking about influence. Now, most people understand that, though. If you ask people, as I've done, how heritable do you think eye color is? Well, most people would say it's very highly heritable. And in fact, it's over 90% heritable. Again, that means of the differences between people in eye color, 90% of that variance can be ascribed to inherited DNA differences. It's not about one individual. It's about differences in a population. And as I mentioned with weight, most people would say there's some genetic influence, but it's pretty small. But in fact, as I said, it's about 60% heritable, which is kind of a surprise to most people. And then one of the areas I study, school performance, same thing. People will say, yeah, there's some genetic influence, but in fact, it's very substantial. It's about 60% heritable. So just to deal with school performance, which is one of my special interests, Here, this slide summarizes 15 years of work in my TEDS twin study. And what this slide shows is that from the early school days, all the way through GCSEs, it's about 60% heritable. So that means, say, with GCSE scores, about 60% of the differences between children in the UK are due to inherited DNA differences. It's not 100%. The variance that's not explained by genetics, we ascribe to the environment, which is defined very broadly as anything that's not due to inherited DNA differences. So it's not, school performance was something that hadn't been studied much before, but psychology has changed so much in the 50 years that I've been doing research in this field, where when I was in graduate school in the 70s, genetics was never mentioned in psychology. Schizophrenia, we were told, is due to what your mother did to you in the first few years of life. Genetics was never given a look in on that. And in the subsequent 4 decades, what we've found is it's sort of the other way. The challenge now is to find any trait in psychology that's reliably measured that does not show significant genetic influence. Everything shows genetic influence. But it isn't just twin studies. The other major method is called the adoption method. The twin study is like a biological quasi-experiment because you have these 2 biologically different types of twins. The adoption method is like a social experiment. If nature and nurture run together in families, like with weight, then we've always assumed it's due to nurture, but how can we disentangle effects of nature? Well, one straightforward way of doing that is to study parents and children who are related genetically but not environmentally. And that is, for example, biological parents, birth parents who relinquish their kids for adoption at birth, and then you study these children in adopted families. So those parents and children don't share genes, they share environment. I mean, they don't share genes. The other type of parent, the adoptive parent of those children, share nurture, but not nature with those children. So the adoption method then, it's interesting with weight, for example, parents and offspring correlate about 0.35 for weight, body mass index. I'm sure you all know correlations go from 0 to 1. So 0.35, they're 50% similar. They're 0.5 similar genetically. So that tells you right away, it can't be all genetic because they'd be correlated 0.5. But is it nature or nurture? Well, for a century, people assume that weight runs in families for reasons of nurture, which makes perfectly good sense because parents provide the food and lifestyles for their children. But in the adoption studies, what you find is that adoptive parents and their adopted children correlate 0 for weight. And so that suggests nurture isn't important, but is it really nature? And the answer is yes, that the adopted children correlate as much with their birth parents that they never saw after the first few days of life as kids do with their biological parents who rear them, nature plus nurture relatives. Well, that's the sort of thing we found. This is an adoption study I've been doing for 40 years, and this is the first 20 years of research on general learning ability, cognitive ability. And this is well known that there's a correlation between, these are nature and nurture parents who share genes and environment with their children. And the correlation goes up from infancy to early childhood to adolescence. Oops, I lost my y-axis there, but it goes up to a correlation of about 0.4. So is it nature or nurture? Literally for a century, psychologists have assumed it's nurture. Again, a reasonable hypothesis. Parents provide a lot of the stimulation and early environment for the children. But here's what we found for birth parents. These are the 250 children adopted away at birth where we tested the birth parents before they relinquished the kid for adoption. And what you can see is by adolescence, these kids correlate just as much with their birth parents whom they never saw after birth as kids do reared by their parents, suggesting that what runs in families is DNA. It's nature, not nurture. To test that, then, we can look at adoptive parents, and children's cognitive ability doesn't correlate at all with the cognitive ability of their adoptive parents. And that's a direct test of nurture, in the sense of it's getting at whatever the parents provide to the children. So I know it's a lot to take on board, but this has led to this second finding I want to talk to you about that's relevant to parents. The first is that genetics is so much more important than people ever thought. On average, across all psychological traits, inherited DNA differences count for about half of the differences between people. That's for personality, for psychopathology, and for cognitive abilities. The second finding, though, it has to do with studying the environment in genetically sensitive designs. And this topic I just raised, that these adopted kids don't resemble their adoptive parents, is a direct test of what we call shared environment. It's what most people mean by nurture. It's the effects of growing up in a family. And this paper is the paper that started this field. And it's basically asking, why are children in the same family so different? Genetics doesn't have any trouble explaining that, because children in a family are 50% similar genetically, and they're 50% similar with their parents genetically. But that means they're 50% different. Our environmental theories from Freud onwards have trouble explaining why kids growing up in the same family with the same parents are so different. And this is called non-shared environment. It's environments that are important, but they're not making kids in a family similar. So for cognitive ability, what we find is in childhood, where most of the studies were done, this is the one area where we find evidence for shared environment, that is, for influence of nurture. Up through adolescence, it accounts for about 25% of the variance of learning ability. And the way to test this, the best way, I showed you that adoptive parents don't correlate with their adopted kids, but they're 30 years difference in age, and they're raised in different secular environments. But a third of adoptive families adopt a second child. So in our study, we have adoptive children, that is, genetically unrelated kids reared in the same family, and they correlate 0.25 for general cognitive ability. That's a direct test of what I'm calling shared environment. But here's the amazing finding. You study those same kids 10 years later, and they correlate 0. So in the long run, when children leave the family, that influence of shared environment goes down to 0. So there's no shared environment after adolescence, even for cognitive ability, which is the only area in psychology that shows shared environmental influence. For personality and psychopathology, there's no evidence for shared family environmental influence. Now that should sound a little weird to you because, well, there's a lot of research that's been going on for 30 years trying to figure out what these non-shared environmental factors are. One way to do that is to study more than one kid in a family and say, to what extent do they experience environments differently? MZ twins are particularly useful because they're genetically identical. So anything that makes them different is by definition one of these non-shared environments. So there's a lot of work along those lines, but in 30 years, there's been little progress in identifying what these non-shared environmental factors are that make kids in a family different from one another. And so I've come to conclude, and this is all described in length in my book, and I'm just giving you kind of the bumper sticker, bottom line state conclusions about it. But I've come to conclude that non-shared environment is essentially unsystematic and unstable. Whatever it is, it's not stable across time. And it doesn't seem to be due to any of the systematic factors that we've studied. And you can see where this is all leading to in terms of parents. But that's the second finding, non-shared environment. This is the third finding. And it should seem weird to you because, you know, parents, what they do correlates with how their kids are. I mean, it just seems so obvious that there's correlations between parenting and kids' outcomes. But the third finding has to do with what looks like systematic environmental effects are often genetic effects in disguise. And this is the topic I first wrote about in 1980s, and then I summarized it in 1991, called The Nature of Nurture. It began by showing that the measures of the environment that we use in psychology show substantial genetic influence. And you say, how can this be? Because the environment doesn't have DNA. But what it's about is that we're not measuring an objective environment out there, independent of people. What we're measuring with life events and parenting is behavior, and behavior shows genetic influence. So in the past, we assumed environmental measures are environmental, and they affect behavior environmentally. Well, what if you treat an environmental measure in a genetic design, like a twin study, and you ask, is there genetic or environmental influence on it? Well, there shouldn't be any genetic influence because it's an environmental measure. Instead, what you find is, in now over 100 studies, is that most environmental measures that we use show genetic influence. Not 50%, but 25%, which is quite surprising. And then this is where the nature of nurture comes in and where it's really relevant to parenting. We can correlate parent measures with kids' outcomes, but we know parenting measures, that is how disciplinarian you are, how warm and supportive and touchy-feely you are with your kids, those things show genetic influence. So if the environmental measures show genetic influence and the outcome measures in kids show genetic influence, then it's likely that it's possible that genetics can explain some of that correlation. And after scores of studies, on average, genetics explains about half of that difference. So that's why I say what looks like systematic effects of the environment are often genetic effects in disguise. So what does this matter? Well, it matters because if you interpret these environmental measures as causing children's outcomes, you can go seriously wrong. They're just correlations. And what I'm saying is, and as you know, I'm sure, correlations do not imply causation. And what we're saying is, we even know that genetics is explaining part of that. So it isn't just causal environmentally. And then the second reason why it's important is it allows you, if you can control for genetics, you can study environmental effects that are not due to genetics. They're direct genetic environmental effects. But what interests me the most is just a general view of thinking about how the environment works for children. And the way we've always thought about it is sort of like psychology came out of stimulus response theory in the 1920s and 30s, where you study rats in a cage and you look at how they learn or how their temperament, and you do things to them. You starve them, you shock them, you do things to them, and you've controlled their environment, and they just passively receive the environments you impose. And we carry that over to human development as well. We think of the environment as the environment out there, independent of what we do. But what this model suggests is a genetic way of thinking about experience. And it's sort of like an active approach. The way genetics works, I believe, in general, is not to hardwire you for things, but rather to nudge you in certain directions that make you instead of an environment imposed on you, you actively seek and modify and create environments that are correlated with your genetic propensity. So we call that gene-environment correlation. And I think that's generally the way the environment works. I mean, you might be surprised of all the dozens of cognitive abilities, spatial, memory, verbal, the most highly heritable single test is vocabulary. And, you might say, well, that's nuts because you don't inherit vocabulary words. But that's sort of the point. I've got 6 grandchildren, and one of them has always been into words. She always wants to know about nuances of words. Why do you use that word? How is this word different? Whereas my other 5 grandchildren is basically whatever, you know what I mean, and who's going to have the better vocabulary? Well, it's obviously the one that's in that channel and tuned into the nuances of words. So I think that's a general model for the way the environment works. So in summary, what I've said about these three findings is first, that inherited DNA differences account for about half of the differences between us in all psychological traits. It varies from a low of about 40% for personality traits to about 60% for cognitive abilities. But genetics, inherited DNA differences are very important. The environment's important too. It accounts for the other half. But as I've talked about with non-shared environment, I believe it's unsystematic, basically random, idiosyncratic, chance. So it's important, but it's not systematic. And then second, this is the third finding, what looks like systematic effects of the environment are genetic effects in disguise. So that's what gets to the title of my book, Blueprint. That is, DNA is the major systematic force making us who we are as individuals. And I emphasize systematic because the environment's important, but it doesn't work the way we thought it worked. It's not systematic. It's not due to nurture. And this, just to get this point across, what I'm saying is that if you had been mixed up in the maternity room ward of the hospital and the wrong parents took you home, and even though you grew up with different parents in a different family and went to different schools, etc., they had different friends, what I'm saying is that you would be much the same person you are now, because it's the DNA that provides the systematic influences that make you who you are. And this isn't just hypothetical. This is Bobby, who grew up in a very wealthy family in Long Island outside of New York. And he went to university at the age of 19. And on the first day of school, everyone was calling Bobby Eddie, and he thought it was some sort of psychology experiment, looking around for the hidden cameras. But then he met Eddie, and they quickly worked out they had the same birthday and they were adopted. And the publicity that came from that, neither they nor their parents knew about this. And the publicity that came from it led to the rare circumstance of a third identical twin. So identical twins are a single fertilized egg that divides in the first few days of life, making them clones of one another. Sometimes one of those clones divides again, creating triplets. So these are three identical triplets. And what's interesting especially is that Bobby grew up in this very wealthy family. Dave in the middle grew up in a lower class immigrant family in the Bronx. And who am I down to? Eddie grew up in a middle class family where the father was a secondary school teacher. And the parents had extremely different parenting styles. And yet they're so obviously similar physically, it's hard to tell them apart. But also in terms of personality, they're quite outgoing. What you don't see here is in the psychopathology, they were all depressive. And in terms of academic performance, they're a student of a certain type of student. They really didn't like school. They're well-read though, they're intelligent, they're verbal, but they just didn't like the stricture of school. So when they got together, they actually all dropped out of university, decided what they wanted to do was to start a nightclub in New York, in Manhattan, called Triplets. And it did make $1 million in the first year. This is described in a great film, documentary called Three Identical Strangers, which won an award at Sundance. So it's a great demonstration of the points I'm making, but it is just an anecdote. However, this anecdote is backed up by other systematic studies of twins reared apart, as well as classical twins reared together. So those are the three findings, and you can see how they're going to relate to parenting, which is described in these later chapters in my book. And the 4 pages of the book that got the most attention was about genetics and parenting. You know, there are literally thousands of books. I mean, if you just look on Amazon, there's 60,000 entries. There are thousands of books on parenting, but they're not scientific. You know, if you ask, where's the evidence? They come up shorthanded. And the other thing that irritates me from a psychological point of view is they're often very dogmatic, and they're dogmatic in completely opposite directions, you know? So it's really not a good advertisement for psychology. And what also irritates me is they tend to make parents anxious. You know, what sells copies, what sells newspaper articles and magazine articles is making parents worry about, if you do this, there's going to be these long-term consequences. Hardly any of these books even mention genetics. And so based on what I've told you so far, you can see where I'm going with this. I think genetics is the single most important thing that parents need to know about parenting. So if you think about these topics I've raised, if there's anybody who thinks that children are a blob of clay that you mold to be what you want them to be, it's very important they get this message. Parents don't have nearly as much control as they think, because genetics is there. It's influence, but nonetheless, it accounts for the majority. It accounts for all of the systematic variants. The environment's important, but it's not these systematic effects. It's chance, and parents don't have control over chance. Now, again, I said before, early on, it's what is rather than what could be. It's not to say you can't make a difference. You can make your kid very good at music. It's how I ruined my relationship with my kids. I thought to be civilized, you had to learn music to the point where you can sight read at least. But being ornery, and I think that's genetic as well, they said, oh, I'm not going to do that. And in fact, they weren't very good at music, and they could see that their friends without any music training were composing music, you know? So it really was a rebellion with my sons, because I was enforcing this view on them rather than being sensitive to genetic differences. They're good at a lot of things. And I think what parents should do is recognize how children are different and help them do the things they want to do, rather than trying to force them to do what we think they ought to do. And so you can make a difference. I could have forced my kids to take these piano lessons until they could sight read, but I had to eventually give up because it was really ruining my relationship with them. And it is the relationship, I think, that is important. I don't think parents have very much control, and that's going to be a good thing. 1% of the population gets diagnosed as schizophrenic. And if you think you're responsible for everything that your child becomes, how do you explain the kid becoming schizophrenic? And in the past, with Freud and other psychoanalysts, you would be told it's because of what you did in the first few years of life, which is incredibly wicked, because you can't do anything about that. And it's dead wrong. There's no evidence for that whatsoever. There's a strong evidence for genetic influence. So my main message about parenting is that I think parents should relax, not to say you just give up, you don't do anything. You try to help them because you love them. You don't help them, you don't do things for them because you want them to become what you want them to become. You spend more of your time trying to figure out what they like to do and what they're good at. You give them opportunities to do things, and you help them to do what they want to do because you love them. You know, I think a good analogy is if you choose a partner because you think, well, pretty good material, I'll make them into something really good I want them to be, and you do things for them to make them be what you want them to be, it's a disaster. And I think we should think that way more about our kids, find out what they'd like to do and help them do it. And I think this should be a liberating message for parents, which I think is a good thing too, to relieve them of some of the anxiety from the getting bombarded with these messages trying to make parents guilty and anxious, which is what a lot of these parenting books are about. So the bottom line message for me is I think we ought to enjoy our children, and part of that enjoyment is watching them become who they are genetically. So that's the first half of the book, and the second half is about the DNA revolution. And I'll just mention that briefly. There's so much to say about this, because the first half of the book, the stuff I've told you about so far, I think should give people a reconceptualization of childhood and what your role is as a parent. The second half of the book is going to really transform parenting. And that's because we can now predict these differences through DNA itself. And I'll just touch on this because, and maybe if you're interested, I could come back sometime and talk a lot more about it. But I'm trying to decide whether, I think I'm going to just mention that, yeah, because I do want to spend time for Q&A, and maybe if we run out of steam there, I can talk to you some more about this topic. But basically what we can do now is we can actually get DNA just from spit. Maybe 25 million people have paid for companies like 23andMe to do DNA testing on them. And you just need one cell, and you can get that from saliva, for example, or blood or any tissue, and then genotype it. And we can now genotype with this chip that is quite cheap now, called it's a genotyping chip. We can genotype millions of DNA differences throughout the genome, and that method has allowed us to identify many of the genes that affect all of these complex traits. So these are called polygenic scores because it's not one gene. The surprise was to find we're talking about heritability being due not to 100 or 1,000, but tens of thousands of DNA differences. But we can put those together in what we call a polygenic score. And this is what's going to revolutionize parenting. I don't know if you heard of the movie Gattaca that came out in 1997. It raises issues of testing at birth and actually DNA dating, which means couples getting together based on their DNA profiles, and embryo and testing preconception in embryos and embryo selection. So these are huge topics. Jamie Metzl, M-E-T-Z-L, has a nice book called Hacking Darwin on this topic. But what's interesting is Gattaca came up with all of these predictions. It was very prescient in terms of the science, because at that time, none of the tools to do that were even thought of. They weren't available. Yet all of those things, believe it or not, are actually happening now. So testing at birth that's always gone on. It's gone on for 45 years. You may not know that, but it's just testing for a few genes. There's now 150 million set aside in the NHS to do this in the UK as well. And when I say 25 million people have paid to have their own DNA done, tested, the hottest thing now is for parents to do the DNA testing on their children. And part of the reason the NHS is doing this and people are interested in it is because in medicine, we're moving away from a model of waiting until people have a heart attack to predicting a heart attack and preventing it, which you can do. And it's so much more cost effective economically, but also in terms of quality of life. So it's a no-brainer, I think, in terms of medicine. And if you want to predict, the best early warning system we have for heart attacks and most common disorders is DNA. And parents are interested as well in knowing if there are these problems. But anyway, it's happening in a lot of the world right now about testing at birth. But then embryo selection, believe it or not, is a hot topic. And that's because people do go through in vitro fertilization because they're infertile. I'm sure people know what in vitro fertilization is. But there are 10,000, say, single gene disorders. Most of them are very rare and they're recessive, which means these are single gene traits, unlike the common disorders and complex traits I've been talking about. You may be familiar with, say, phenylketonuria. 1% of the institutionalized population about 50 years ago was caused by this single gene mutation. A recessive mutation, if you remember your Mendel, is one where you need a copy from both parents. You need 2 copies to show the disease. If you only have one, you're a carrier. Well, it turns out of the 10,000 disorders, 90% of them are recessive, and that's because the carriers carry the single mutation, but they don't show the disease. But 25% of their offspring will show the disease if 2 carriers mate. Well, in the past, up until the last few years, the way you find out about that, because these are rare diseases and they probably haven't shown up in your family, is you have a child who has one of these rare disorders. Then, if you want to have other children, you go through in vitro fertilization, and you can test the embryos from in vitro fertilization, where about a dozen embryos are created. And you can then screen for the 25% that would have the single gene disorder, which often is devastating and lethal. So what's happening now is that people are using polygenic scores to, once you've selected the eggs that don't have the single gene mutation, you can select out other sorts of medical problems, but you're still left with several embryos, and you can only implant one because it's so successful. You used to implant two, but they got too many twins as a result of that. So this is something that is happening, and where people are choosing its baby, their embryo, based on some of these polygenic things, like based on height, and most worrying, intelligence. Now, being philosophers, I think you may be aware that this is often used as a classic problem. You do have to decide. You can only put one embryo in, but you could decide not to decide, but that's still a decision. And you could, so Jamie Metzl talks about this in his book, Hacking Darwin, and it's also in my book, Blueprint, as well. But the thing you find most amusing probably is not just testing at birth or testing before birth, but testing before conception, before you even get together. And in the movie Gattaca, this is about DNA dating. People would get together based on their DNA profiles. But there are at least a dozen companies now that will provide this information to couples. It's mostly a nonsense because these polygenic scores aren't that predictive. But yet, this is probably the single most important advantage of the DNA revolution. Because if couples decide, if before they get together, if they decide they're going to go through screening for these genetic mutations, can you see that you could almost eliminate these thousands of single gene disorders, which some, how these numbers go, but some economists have estimated saving $1 trillion a year by telling prospective couples, you are carriers for this particular genetic disease, meaning 25% of your offspring will show it, will have the disease. And you have lots of options open to you then. But you never would have done this before the DNA revolution made it possible to screen, because each of these are very rare. But it's estimated that you have about a 2% chance of being a matched carrier with your spouse. So if you knew, for example, Ashkenazi Jews are at a much higher risk of Tay-Sachs disease, which is a horrible disease where the children die by the age of 5. And it's a recessive, single gene recessive. So when the Ashkenazi Jews in the world learned about this, even 10 years ago, even before the latest techniques were available, they, because the marriages are somewhat arranged anyway, all couples, before they got married, were tested for Tay-Sachs. And most of them decided not to get married if they had Tay-Sachs, but they could decide not to have children. They had other options open to them. But that has basically eliminated Tay-Sachs from these Ashkenazi Jewish populations. So that's just an example of what you could do with this carrier matching. So when you say DNA dating, it does sound completely frivolous, but it has this most important impact on reducing the burden of these single gene disorders. So I had a whole lot of slides talking about the DNA revolution in particular, but you can see why some parents would want to do DNA testing for their children. If you found out your child had a high risk for alcoholism, for example, you want to say, it doesn't mean you're going to become alcoholic. It just means you have a greater genetic risk than other people. And the neat thing about this is you cannot become alcoholic unless you drink a lot of alcohol over a long period of time. So when your child's an adolescent, you might say, you remember that genetic risk you have for alcoholism? Don't worry, it doesn't mean you're going to be alcoholic, but maybe you should realize that if you drink as much as your friends, you might be at a greater risk of becoming addicted to alcohol. And so do what we all should do, that is monitor your use, take holidays from it. So I think a lot of these things that we worry about as parents can be put in this preventive model. And the scores we have now aren't tremendously predictive, but one thing I just wanted to mention, because it's my specific area of research, the strongest polygenic score that we have in the behavioral sciences is for educational achievement, and that was our work. We can explain 15% of the variance in GCSE scores in the UK today. Now, it's 60% heritable, so we still have a long way to go, but this has only been in the last 3 years. And it's not 100%, but it never will be because it's only 60% heritable. But 15% is a lot. In the behavioral sciences, we rarely explain 5% of the variance. And just to make this point, because people say, oh, it's only 15%. Well, how many of you have spent a lot of money having your kids tutored or gone to private schools because you want them to do better on GCSE scores? So my question is, 15% of the variance can be explained by DNA. How much of the variance do you think can be explained by school quality as measured by Ofsted? You know, we spend something like 25 million a year doing Ofsted ratings. I'm sure you all know what those are. Go to the school and, you know, examiners go to the school, and they're very good assessments of school quality. But nobody had asked previously, before we published a paper last year on this, about how much variance in GCSE scores do you explain with these differences in the quality of schools? And the answer is 4%. So we can explain almost 4 times more variance with DNA. So that's the way this is all going. And the reason I wrote the book Blueprint is because I wanted people to have sufficient DNA literacy to be able to explain, you know, to have an adult conversation about these issues, because it is happening. And so, you know, the genome genie is out of the bottle. And so we need to talk about, as you can see, these very big issues. And I'm certain that they are going to transform parenting. So that, I'm sorry I rushed through the last, but I actually haven't given a talk about genetics and parenting. And I would be happy to come back sometime and tell you the details about it, including things like how we go about finding genes related to these complex traits. But I think I'll stop there. And I realize, because I've gone a little over 45 minutes, and I will be excused for 15 more minutes, so I can go to 8:45 at least, trying to address your questions. So I'll stop there and turn it back to Don.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that, Robert. It's of some interest. I see 1 or 2 comments coming in on the chat room, and I think the thing we must remember on this is that we're not trying to decide whether this result is good or bad. We're trying to decide whether it's true. And the evidence that Professor Plomin has been spending the last few years looking at does seem to confirm that it's true. So we have to decide where we go from there. Can I hand it over to Andreas, who will share the questions and discussions, because he has access to the chat information.
No, that's great. Again, Robert, thank you very much for a fantastic talk. We talked about DNA dating, DNA testing, embryo selection, gene editing. I mean, you know, it's been a real tour de force. So thank you very much for that. And it would be really helpful if you could all unmute yourselves and give Robert a big round of applause, rather than just doing it, you know, in Zoom. Very good, very good. Okay, so I've been monitoring the chat room, and we've got quite a few discussions going around nurture and nature, and also we started off in the chat room with Lamarck and some pro and anti-Lamarckians. So it would be interesting, Robert, to ask you what your stance is on Lamarck and acquired characteristics.
Right. Well, what Mendelian genetics is about is that Lamarck's theory, although reasonable, is wrong. Yeah. There's no evidence for the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Now, people talk about epigenetics. Maybe that's what's underlying this sort of thing. But, inherited DNA sequence isn't susceptible to acquired characteristics. So, about epigenetics, that's a long story, but basically you don't inherit epigenetic marks as people thought. There's some examples in mice, there's a couple of single genes, but we have an elaborate mechanism to wipe out those marks when an embryo is formed, from the mother. So what I say is that all we inherit is DNA sequence differences. And of course, gene transcription, expression, epigenetics, all of those other mechanisms are important in terms of how genes work. But when I say inheritance, I only mean inherited DNA differences.
Okay. And as a follow-up to that particular sort of discussion in the chat room, Duncan McGibbon asked, there is a phenomenon in psychology called reversion to the mean. Twins too tend to show opposite features to their parents in degree. This refutes your findings. What is your view?
Well, I don't see that at all. Parents, it's interesting. It's called regression to the mean, which is a statistical phenomenon. If you take two tall parents, their children are going to be taller than average because it's about 90% heritable. But on average, their kids will be less tall than their parents. That's where the statistical phenomenon of regression to the mean comes in. It's really a very fundamental part of genetics. So I don't see where it's at all a refutation. It's what you expect genetically. It's just as true, by the way, if you take tall children and ask about the height of their parents will be taller than average, but less tall than the kids you selected for being tall. It's just a statistical phenomenon because you don't have 100% prediction.
Mm-hmm. Good. Another thing that came up in the chat room is about genetic determination and disposition.
Yeah.
And would you like to talk to that?
Yes. I'm glad that was brought up. As I tried to say early on, we're not talking about hardwired deterministic factors. So I mentioned there are thousands of single genes. Those are deterministic and hardwired. If you have the gene for Huntington's disease, which is a gene on the tip of chromosome 4, you'll die from Huntington's, which is what happened to Woody Guthrie. And so it is hardwired in the sense that nothing that you do or eat or exercise makes a difference. You'll die from Huntington's, that gene, that mutation, unless something else kills you first. The thing is, that's how people learn about genetics from Mendel. His pea plant experiments were basically about problems in plants and pea seeds, whether they have smooth or wrinkled seeds. It's just a single gene mutation that if you were a pea plant and you had that mutation, you would have a wrinkled seed rather than the nice smooth seed that you might expect. So there are these hardwired single gene deterministic factors, but when you deal with complex traits and common disorders, as we do in psychology and psychiatry, what we've learned is that they are not due to a single gene or even 10 or 100 or 1,000. We're talking about tens of thousands of DNA differences of very tiny effect on average in the population. So that switches it from deterministic to probabilistic. Mm-hmm. So that's why I tried to emphasize influences, nudges, probabilistic propensities rather than pre-programmed determinism. And so it also means in terms of parents, it doesn't mean when you show genetic influence, you just say, oh, well, nothing I can do about this, because of all the other examples I gave, that parents are providing a relationship with their children. If they really do think that they determine their kids' outcomes, then it's important for them to recognize they have much less control than they think they have. So that's such a big topic, but those are sort of the highlights for me anyway.
Well, I think that's a really important comment to make. So thank you very much for that, Robert. That's really helpful, and I think that clears up a lot about determination and dispositions, as you call it, the nudging. Good. Sian has made a comment to say that her friend was at her wit's end because her relationship with her son, but Sean, having twins, and presumably non-identical twins, made her realise that much of it was down to, not down to her nurture, but down to the twins, their nature, in terms of their behaviour.
Yeah, that's such a great point. You know, there's this aphorism that parents are environmentalists until they have more than one child. So with your first child, you can explain anything. Suppose, you may be surprised, one of the most heritable early personality characteristics is shyness. You know, all kids are shy at a certain age, but I mean, some kids are shyer than others. So if you had a kid who's very shy and you ask the parent, why is your child so shy? They'll give you one of two answers. It's either because I took them out too much when she was young, or I did not take her out enough when she was young. Yeah. That's part of the problem with environmental explanations. You can explain anything, and that isn't good for a theory, because you know you don't want to be able to explain everything, because then you explain nothing in a way. And then when the parent has a second child, because it's heritable, the chances are the other child, the next child, isn't going to be as shy. And then that's when parents realize, I didn't do that. You know, if you took them out a lot when they were young, you do it probably for both of them. So that's when parents begin to realize that they have much less control and that their children are different from very early on in life. And this Norwegian cult author, Karl Ove Nonshared, which I think a fifth of the Norwegian population has bought his book. And it's a 7,500-page autobiography. It's like Proust in psychology, where great detailed explanations of things, like 50 pages about taking his 4-year-old daughter to a birthday party. But they're psychologically so acute. And he has 3 kids. And so some of his descriptions of this are really powerful, you know, unlike the dry statistics that I deal with.
Okay, no, that's great. And Anna comments, it sounds like an excellent excuse to avoid personal responsibility, but I suppose we're not saying that parenting don't have any influence whatsoever. I think, but it's not as pronounced as we had thought.
Yeah, but you know, if you think of schizophrenia, you know, you don't find out about that until your kid is, you know, into early adulthood usually. You know, in the very late teens or early 20s. And there isn't much sign before then, maybe a gradual withdrawal. But imagine if you were told, well, that's because of what you did early in your life, in the child's life. And that's really wicked. And it's usually mother blaming. It's because of what the mother did to the child early in life. So I think the people, the groups that fund a lot of genetic research in psychopathology, like schizophrenia, are parents of kids who have psychopathology. And I've heard people say, along the lines of this question, this comment, well, you're just letting the parents off the hook. But that makes me very angry, because they don't deserve to be on the hook. It's not what they did. And so I don't think the parents could have done much about that. You know, they didn't make their child schizophrenic. And it's the reason they're so supportive of genetic research is they realize it's a major systematic factor. And we need to find out more about that. And maybe by being able to predict risk for schizophrenia, we might be able to prevent it. Because we sure aren't very good at curing it. We don't cure it at all. We find workarounds, and we find drugs that ameliorate the symptoms. But I do think the preventive model, even for something as severe as schizophrenia, is a useful way of thinking about it. You know, for example, a lot of the interest in psychological approaches to this involve cognitive behavior therapy to deal with the symptoms. You know, to say, Well, when you get paranoid like that, you've got to notice it. And there are things you can do to avoid going down that rabbit hole, for example. So that's not curing it either, but it's ameliorating the symptoms without drugs. But none of that works after someone's schizophrenic. All of these things, and even medicine, most disorders in our society work better the earlier we can intervene to prevent the problems from occurring. Okay. So that's another long story, but it's an important point, I think.
Yeah. No, and I think that's great. I think we draw it to conclusion, because I know you've got another commitment now, Robert. But okay. Just to let you know that the chat room is full of people who really appreciated your talk. They actually want you to come back to Bath in person and give another talk, which is also
that would be great. I'd love to do that.
Yes, I would certainly vote for that.
Okay, there's so much more to talk about. I mean, I really did skip the last half of my talk on the DNA stuff. So I think people would find that very interesting, scary perhaps, but it's important for people to know about it, because it isn't hypothetical. It really is happening.
No, absolutely. So thank you very much for that, Robert. Just before we go, I'm just going to let you know about a couple of talks coming up. There is actually a talk on philosophy in the German group on the 22nd of April, based on the genius of Immanuel Kant and his ethics. I'm actually delivering that talk in English. So if anybody is interested from a philosophy group perspective, as it is in English, then please join. We then in May have a talk on artificial intelligence versus artificial consciousness by Grant Bartley, the editor of Philosophy Now magazine. And then in June, we have a talk by Dr. Karim Ismail on Ludwig Wittgenstein. So that's April, May, and June sorted out, and I hope we'll see you there. But before we go, and as a final act today, could you please all unmute yourself once again and show your appreciation to Robert for a fascinating and excellent talk.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.